High above the fields of occupied Europe in the summer of 1943, a formation of German fighters banked toward a strange new shape, climbing out of the haze. It was massive, round-nosed, broad-winged, built like something dragged out of a factory rather than carved for the sky. The German pilots studied it for only a moment before making up their minds. This could not be a serious fighter. It was too big, too heavy, too slow to matter. Then the American pilots opened fire, and within seconds, the sky told a different story. This is the story of how a fighter plane the Luftwaffe once dismissed as a joke became one of the most feared aircraft over the skies of the Third Reich. It is the story of the P-47 Thunderbolt, and how the United States turned a machine nobody respected into a weapon nobody could ignore. For the pilots of the Luftwaffe, the rules of air combat had been written in Spain, in Poland, in France, and over the fields of England. A good fighter was light. A good fighter turned hard, climbed fast, and struck like a blade. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190 were built on that philosophy, and they had earned their reputation the hard way, against some of the best pilots in the world. When German airmen looked at the P-47, they measured it against that same standard, and by that standard, it failed almost every test. It was enormous for a single-seat fighter, nearly twice the weight of a 1-9 when fully loaded. Its silhouette was blunt and awkward, with a barrel-shaped fuselage wrapped around a giant engine. Next to the sleek lines of a Focke-Wulf, it looked like a delivery truck trying to fly. Early encounters seemed to confirm every assumption. In a tight turning fight at medium altitude, the Thunderbolt could feel sluggish. American pilots new to the aircraft were still learning its habits, still discovering how to coax speed and power out of something so heavy. To a confident, battle-hardened German fighter pilot, this was exactly the kind of opponent he wanted to meet. And here is the part of the story that deserves to be told honestly. The Germans were not entirely wrong. The P-47 truly was not built to outturn a Messerschmitt. It really did struggle in certain fights, especially early in its combat career, especially at the altitudes and speeds where German fighters were most comfortable. If the story stopped there, it would be a story about a plane that never lived up to its size. But the story does not stop there, because the Germans had made a mistake that would cost them dearly. They had judged the P-47 by the wrong rules entirely. They were expecting a European fighter. America had not built one. To understand why the Thunderbolt would become so dangerous, you have to understand what it was actually designed to do. At the heart of the aircraft sat the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a massive 18-cylinder radial engine that produced enormous horsepower, paired with a turbo-supercharger system that ran ductwork through the length of the fuselage. That system was the real secret of the airplane. While most fighters lost power as they climbed into thin air, the P-47's turbo-supercharger kept feeding it dense, pressurized air at altitudes where other fighters were already gasping. This was not an aircraft optimized for a knife fight at low altitude. It was optimized to dominate the high sky, the very altitude where American heavy bombers needed protection the most. Every pound of that airplane had a purpose. The weight came from the engine, from the turbo system, from thick armor plating around the cockpit, from a rugged airframe built to take damage and keep flying, and from a fuel and ammunition load built for endurance rather than elegance. The P-47 was not designed to dance gracefully through the air. It was designed to survive, to dive with brutal speed, to hit with overwhelming force, and to bring its pilot home. America did not build a European fighter dressed in American paint. America built an American fighter, shaped by American priorities, American industry, and an American theory of air combat that had almost nothing to do with a graceful turning duel. The first hint of what that meant came in the form of disbelief. German pilots would line up a perfect shot, walk their cannon fire across a Thunderbolt's wing and fuselage, watch pieces of metal tear away in the slipstream, and then watch the American fighter simply keep flying. It should not have been possible. In a liquid-cooled fighter like the Bf-109 or the Spitfire, a single well-placed hit on the coolant system could doom the aircraft within minutes, the engine overheating and seizing long before the pilot could reach safety. The Thunderbolt had no such vulnerability. Its air-cooled radial engine could absorb hits to individual cylinders and continue running, sometimes trailing smoke, sometimes missing pieces of cowling, but still turning the propeller. Pilots came home with enormous holes in their wings. They came home with tails shredded by cannon fire, with cockpits cracked open by shrapnel, with hydraulic systems destroyed, and landing gear barely functioning. Ground crews who inspected the returning aircraft sometimes struggled to understand how they had stayed in the air at all. This was not luck repeating itself over and over. This was the result of deliberate design choices, an aircraft built from the start to absorb punishment that would have ended the flight of almost anything else in the sky. For German pilots who had trained their entire careers to find the one shot that ends a fight quickly, this was deeply unsettling. The prey was not dying the way prey was supposed to die. Then came the second shock, and this one was far worse for the pilots facing it head-on. Because if the P-47 could survive when the Germans got their shots in, it became a nightmare the moment its own guns found their mark. Mounted in the wings were 8 Browning M2 machine guns, each firing rounds nearly half an inch across, each loaded with hundreds of rounds of ammunition per gun. Most German fighters carried a mix of machine guns and 1 or 2 cannons, powerful individually, but limited in total ammunition, built around the idea of a short, precise burst that could bring down a bomber or a fighter in a handful of hits. The Thunderbolt operated on a completely different principle. 8 guns firing together did not produce a burst. They produced a wall. Set to converge at a chosen distance, that wall of fire could shred a wing spar, tear an engine off its mounts, ignite fuel tanks, and turn a fighter's control surfaces into scrap metal in a fraction of a second. German pilots who had grown used to trading fire in short, careful exchanges now found themselves facing an American fighter that did not need to be careful. It simply needed to get its nose on target. Where a single German cannon round might punch through the skin of an aircraft, the concentrated stream from 8 heavy machine guns could open a fighter up like a tin can. Fuselage panels buckled, fuel lines ruptured. Engines that had carried pilots through dozens of missions came apart in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Word of what those guns could do spread quickly through German fighter units, and it changed the way pilots thought about engaging the strange, heavy American fighter they had once mocked. But firepower and durability were only part of the equation. The other part was a lesson that American pilots had to learn the hard way, through losses, through frustration, and eventually through a complete change in how they fought. Early in its combat career, some American pilots tried to fight the Thunderbolt the way they had been trained to fight any fighter, turning and maneuvering against opponents who were lighter and more nimble. It rarely worked. Slowly, painfully, a new doctrine took hold among the men who flew it. Stop trying to outturn the enemy. Use altitude instead. Use the dive. Use the sheer mass of the airplane as a weapon rather than a handicap. The tactic became known as boom and zoom, and it turned every one of the P-47's supposed weaknesses into a strength. American pilots learned to hold height above German formations, waiting, watching, choosing the moment. Then they would dive, using gravity and that massive engine to build speed no lightweight German fighter could match, slashing through the enemy formation with guns blazing, and using that same momentum to climb back to safety before an opponent could turn to follow. A German fighter that tried to match a Thunderbolt in a dive was taking a serious risk, because the American fighter's weight, once converted into speed, became almost impossible to catch. This was the moment the joke stopped being funny. The aircraft the Luftwaffe had mocked as too heavy to be dangerous had become a predator that struck from above, hit with overwhelming force, and vanished before a response was possible. That predator became even more dangerous at the altitudes where it mattered most. As American heavy bombers pushed deeper into German airspace, they needed fighter escorts capable of surviving at the same brutal heights where German interceptors were sent to stop them. This was exactly the environment the P-47 had been built for. While German fighters strained for power in the thin, cold air above 20,000 feet, the Thunderbolt's turbo supercharger kept it breathing easily, kept its engine strong, kept it capable of fighting exactly where the bombers needed protection. German pilots, who expected an easy kill at high altitude, instead found an opponent that could match their altitude, dive on them from above, and shrug off hits that should have ended the engagement. And the aircraft kept improving. Early production Thunderbolts had real limitations in climb rate and acceleration, problems that American engineers worked steadily to solve. The introduction of paddle blade propellers, wider and more efficient than earlier designs, dramatically improved the aircraft's climb and overall performance, letting it convert that massive engine's power into speed and altitude more effectively than ever. Drop tanks extended its range far beyond what early escort missions had allowed, letting Thunderbolts accompany bombers deeper into enemy territory and stay in the fight longer once they arrived. This was not a fighter that stayed the same throughout the war. It was a machine that kept learning, kept evolving, kept becoming more dangerous with every new production block that rolled off American assembly lines. And just as German pilots were beginning to understand the Thunderbolt as an air-to-air threat, the United States gave it an entirely new mission. Beneath its wings, the P-47 could carry bombs and rockets, turning it from a bomber escort into a low-level hunter of anything that moved on the ground below. Trucks, trains, fuel depots, armored columns, airfields packed with parked aircraft, all of it became a target. Over Normandy and across the collapsing Western Front, the sound of an approaching Thunderbolt became something German soldiers learned to dread, because daylight movement on the roads of occupied Europe was turning into a gamble with very poor odds. This was the aircraft's second life, and in many ways, it was even more consequential than its record as a fighter. During the invasion of Normandy and the fighting that followed, Allied air superiority meant that German reinforcements, supply columns, and armored units faced constant threat from the sky the moment they tried to move in daylight. The P-47 was not fighting this campaign alone. It was one powerful piece of a much larger Allied air power system working together to strangle German mobility at exactly the moment German commanders needed to move fast. But it was an especially feared piece of that system, a fighter-bomber that could appear suddenly, low and fast, cannons and rockets tearing into anything caught exposed on open roads. Yet the deepest reason the Thunderbolt became such a nightmare for Germany had less to do with any single mission and more to do with what stood behind it, because Germany was never just fighting an airplane. Germany was fighting an entire industrial system built to produce that airplane again and again without slowing down. American factories turned out P-47s by the thousands, along with the engines, propellers, ammunition, and spare parts needed to keep them flying. Trained pilots came through American training programs in a steady stream, replacing losses that would have crippled a smaller air force. Fuel supplies for American squadrons remained plentiful, even as German fuel reserves shrank under the pressure of Allied bombing and a shrinking, strained economy. Ground crews, mechanics, and logistics networks kept aircraft flying at a pace German maintenance and supply systems simply could not match by the later years of the war. Germany could still build excellent aircraft and German engineers and factory workers accomplished remarkable things under increasingly desperate conditions. But building an aircraft was no longer the whole battle. The real battle was replacing pilots fast enough to keep experienced squadrons intact, fueling aircraft that increasingly sat grounded for lack of gasoline, and repairing damage with parts and technicians that were growing scarcer by the month. America, by contrast, could lose aircraft over Europe and have new ones arriving within the airframe's production pipeline in a matter of weeks. It could lose pilots and have freshly trained replacements ready to take their place. This is what made the Thunderbolt so much more than a single dangerous airplane. It was the visible edge of an entire system built to keep producing, training, fueling, and flying at a scale Germany could no longer answer. By the later years of the war, German pilots who survived encounter after encounter with the P-47 carried a growing understanding with them, one that shaped their reports and their memories long after the fighting ended. The size and awkward looks that had once drawn mockery were now remembered as the outward signs of an airplane built for endurance rather than elegance. The durability that had seemed almost unfair in the middle years of the war was remembered as a defining trait of an aircraft that simply refused to go down easily. The 8 guns that had once seemed like overkill were remembered as a weapon capable of ending an engagement in an instant. And the presence of Thunderbolts over roads, railways, airfields, and the collapsing front lines of 1944 and 1945 was remembered as a constant, grinding pressure that never seemed to ease, because for every Thunderbolt shot down, more seemed to arrive to take its place. By the final year of the war, the problem for a German pilot was no longer one heavy American fighter climbing awkwardly toward the fight. The problem was formation after formation of American air power, arriving in waves that never seemed to run out. Put all of it together, and the transformation of the P-47 makes sense from beginning to end. America stopped trying to make it fight like a lightweight European dogfighter, and instead let it become what it was always meant to be, a machine of altitude, speed, and diving power. American pilots learned to use its durability as a weapon in its own right, absorbing punishment that would have ended other fighters and staying in the fight anyway. Engineers kept refining the design, wringing more performance out of it year after year. Commanders gave it a second mission as a fighter bomber, turning it into a hunter of everything that moved on German-held roads. And behind every one of those advances stood American factories, fuel depots, training schools, and supply lines capable of keeping the whole system running at a pace no opponent could match. This was not a story about one clever aircraft design. It was a story about a nation fighting a war of systems and building an airplane that embodied every part of that system at once. German pilots laughed the first time they saw the P-47 Thunderbolt, because by every rule they had learned in years of hard combat, it looked too big, too heavy, and too clumsy to matter. They were judging it by the wrong rules. This was never meant to be a dancer in the sky, elegant and quick through a tight turn. It was built to dive like a stone, absorb damage that should have been fatal, tear apart anything caught in front of its guns, and come home to fly again the next day. It was not simply a fighter plane. It was American industrial power given wings. And by the time the German pilots, who mocked it, truly understood what they were facing, the skies over their own country were no longer theirs to control. If you want more World War II stories told through real archive footage and clear documentary storytelling, subscribe to the channel.